recent Texas conservative school board hurt this separation between state and church and state and religion?
Yeah, let me just spend a few minutes on that. Those of you who aren't familiar with what's going on. Texas has an elected state school board, and it's dominated by a religious right faction that spent some months first of all trying to find a way to work creationism into the curriculum, and they weren't terribly successful with that. So they moved on to social studies / history standards, and they had a good bit more success there. They rammed through a series of changes to downplay some of the history that we've been talking about. In one case, even removing references to Thomas Jefferson that were in one section of the standards, keeping them elsewhere, but removing them from this one section. They talked about the Enlightenment, Enlightenment philosophy. They didn't really want that to be discussed. They downplay that, and they elevated the views of people like Calvin and St. Thomas Aquinas and others. At the same time, they're promoting a sort of generalized idea that separation of church and state's a myth, the Christian nation, all the sort of thing we've been talking about. And the reason that this is alarming is that, well, first of all, it's just bad for the people of Texas. And secondly, Texas is a large market for textbooks, and the fear is that the textbook producers, the textbook publishers, will take these changes that the state board has demanded and put them into textbooks, which are then marketed to other states. Now, I don't know to what extent that will happen. Now, modern printing technology, as I understand it, is sophisticated enough that different editions can be produced. In other words, a Texas edition of a textbook could be produced tailored to the demands of this board, and it wouldn't necessarily end up elsewhere. But also, you have to consider textbook publishers are probably just looking to make money, so they're probably not going to produce a lot of special editions. They want to market the same book in as many states as they can. So it is a concern. It's something we're working on. There are a couple ways to deal with it. One would be for people in Texas to advocate for their legislature to take away some of the powers of this board, because it's micromanaging, to the point where demanding that certain people be removed from standards or added to standards. And some of the things they have done have been very insulting to the Latino community there. They've removed several prominent Latino activists from the standards, and that has angered that constituency, which is a large, powerful block of people in Texas. So we're trying to mobilize those folks, get them involved, and resolve this matter in some way, because it is a very discouraging turn of events.
Okay, the next one looks more like a comment, but I understand that some countries like Denmark or Sweden have a state church. May not be a bad thing because they do births and deaths, own their own cemeteries. They don't have to beg for money like our televangelists because they are paid a salary. So, do you want to comment on that?
Fred, do you want to say anything about that? I have a thought, but I'll let you go first.
I sort of don't know what to say. Well, except that the historic past, which was torture of the dissenters and heretics, that's all gone. A few years ago, I was visiting with a Catholic minister, a priest in western Kansas, and it was a social event, and I don't really get a chance to enjoy conversation with such guys very often, but I said, I made some comment about heresy and heretics, and he said, we don't use that anymore. And I said, it's hundreds of years old. He said, there are separated brothers and sisters in Christ. And I said, well, I kind of like heretic better than that. But, and he was a good guy, a very educated man and so forth and so on. But, so we're all trying to learn from one another, but the churches, instead of claiming the absolutist authority that they used to have gone over to saying, well, we're a social service agency. And so, we register, deaths and births, and we provide for cemeteries and so on. One thing that I might just say about that, in the early 20th century, the freethinkers in Germany were organized on the basis of providing for cremation at a very inexpensive cost. And so they had thousands and thousands of members who joined just so they could have a non-church funeral. If you didn't join something like that, you would have an automatic church funeral. So I would say that it's really sort of dwindled now, and their toehold at this point is through claiming to be social service agents. Same thing in the United States. We're not going to proselytize people. We just want to help them.
I would just add to that. There is a school of thought, somewhat cynical perhaps, but not without some merit, that by insisting on separation, we sort of freed up all these religious groups and made the country more religious. If we had allowed a state church, we might be more like Britain today or Scandinavian countries where they have a state church but nobody goes to it. The data on state churches in those countries is very grim. The number of people attending is in the single digits, and there just isn't much attention paid to them, and they perform almost sort of this ceremonial function. So, the cynic might say, well, we should just, or people who don't particularly like religion might say, well, we should just let that tie exist, and the churches would have died off naturally because that's not really what people want as a state church. Also, too, if you think about secularism, to me there are two kinds. There's legal secularism, which is simply a mandate that the government not promote religion. And then there's cultural secularism. What's the society like at large? How does it feel to the average person? This country has legal secularism and not cultural secularism. In Europe, they don't have legal secularism, but they have cultural secularism. So it's very ironic, and I think that is a modern artifact of the modern effect of the state-established church.
One other thing I might just mention as a footnote, we all remember the Branch Davidians in Waco who were cremated, burned to death, terrible business. They had members from all over the world, particularly Australia. And if you look at the history of sectarian religious organizations, and even larger ones, particularly some of the smaller ones, the Mormons always have a lot of other people from other countries who are their members. And I kept wondering about this, and I realized, well, they could all come to the United States and be as crazy as they wanted, and no one could do anything to them. With freedom of religion. And in most countries, they say, well, you're obviously, deranged in some fashion, hysterical, you need to be treated, and so forth. Here, you can just let it all be. So I think we've had that. That's another sort of little thing that's. And I'm not saying that's necessarily, it's like. Somebody asked H.O. Mencken if he didn't like America, why did he stay? And he said, why do people go to zoos?
Next question. Please comment on the practice of civil religion and its confusion as a cultural practice with sacred religion.
Civil religion, for those of you who don't know the term, is simply the tendency of government to use generically religious language for mainly ceremonial reasons. I mentioned during my remarks how In God We Trust ended up on coinage. In God We Trust is a very good example of civil religion. Under God being inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, another example of civil religion. Also, it's sometimes called ceremonial deism. Courts sometimes use that term. The courts have generally upheld those usages, holding that it's because it's generic and because it's watered down, it's not coercive, it doesn't rise to the level of a church-state violation. Now, I personally don't agree with that, but that's what the courts have said, and that's why those practices have survived. The question is interesting because it makes a distinction between civil religion and sacred faith. And to me, the people that should be most offended by civil religion are not non-believers, but the truly devout. Sometimes when I'm speaking to religious groups, I sometimes say to them, how many people do you know claim their life-changing religious experience to seeing In God We Trust on a nickel? It becomes a meaningless by rote type thing. When children are taught to recite the words of the Pledge of Allegiance, do they really think about the words, or they just say it because they know they have to get through it? So my point is that when you take religion down to that level, and you water it down, and you make it generic, and you just sort of attempt to impose on everybody in this very broad way, it doesn't do any favors to religion.